Alright, so we're taking a look at this chapter on race. So there's actually two chapters in the book that deal with race. And I'm going to I want to summarize this because, of course, you're going to read the chapter. That's where the material for the exams will come from in the quizzes. But I want to really give you a summary of a couple of really core ideas that you should gain as you're going through there. Race is one of those things that people in the United States are probably most confused about, in part because race became such an important issue in our society, of course starting with the treatment of different groups, Native Americans, and then of course the institution of slavery, in which race, this idea of race, became so powerful in our society. So this notion that people really were significantly different based upon which group they belonged to, whether they were white or Native American or African American, that made them extremely different from each other. But you see the title of this says Race White Ain't What You've Been Told. And I put that up there intentionally because I really want you to sort of get to this sort of notion that there is no real biology of race. I mean, this idea, what a race is supposed to be, is a group of people who are significantly genetically different. In some ways, a race, the way it was sort of used in our society, was that it would be like in the animal kingdom where you have subspecies. So, for example, in the cat family, you have animals that are related but that are different enough that they are different species, and that's how we sort of treated race for many years. So with cats, for example, lions and tigers are related. Clearly they're in the same family, but they are different enough that they are not the same species. And we sort of treated race in that way in our society. And so I'm going to just take you through this idea that race itself doesn't exist, or at least not what we think of as race. In fact, what we did was we socially constructed race based upon people's thinking at the time. So you see that the title here is The Social Construction of Race. And what I mean by that is that we, as a group of people, as a culture, decided what a race was and wasn't, and what was particular races, and what made people different. Now, when we do genetic testing nowadays, we actually know that two people who look very dissimilar, that is, that look different from each other, oftentimes are more closely genetically related than two people who look very similar. That's one reason that we say race is a really sort of silly concept or a silly idea from a biological or scientific standpoint, because what people were going by was just what they could see. That is, skin color was considered to be everything, and biologically, skin color is such a very small part of biological difference. Now, we have a lot of similarities or differences that you can't see, but that are part of our genetics. So, just to kind of show you here what happened. And you may not be able to read these real well, but this actually shows the groups that were listed in the census going back to different eras. And I want to show you, because one thing that I talk a lot about in class is that going back historically, society was really divided into this notion early on of people who were white and non-white, white and black. That was about it. Everything else was sort of ignored. Native Americans, for example, were pushed off into these different areas, put on reservations and such, so it's almost like they didn't exist in society from a standpoint of the government and how the government treated it. So this shows you the different groups that have showed up on the census over time. And going back to the earliest days, there was three groups in the 1850 census. That would be white, black, and mulatto. And mulatto would be mixed, which was pretty rare because of the rules against mixing, but we did find it in areas, for example, like New Orleans, which had more of a French culture, but it wasn't very typical in American society at the time. So things have changed to a certain degree here. But this idea of the social construction of race is really the idea that we as a society have created race rules, and our race rules don't actually represent biology or the science behind it. However, even though race is in many ways an illusion, that is something we believe that's not necessarily true, the reason that race is real is it's real because there's a consequence to it. What people believe affects what they do. So whether or not race was scientifically true, it didn't really matter because people treated it like it was, right? So slavery existed because the idea was that African Americans were lesser humans than were whites. That is, they were a different race, a different species in some ways than whites, therefore it was okay. So even though I can tell you scientifically race doesn't exist, it is real from the standpoint that people believing it's real has real consequences. So one of the things that's happened is we've seen a redefinition of race, or the ideas behind race, over time, and it's certainly still going on. I mean, this is something that continues to this day. The civil rights movement's a great example of this. The civil rights movement in the 50s, starting in the late 50s and really kicking off in the 60s, is a movement that's redefining how groups are defined. That is, what does it mean to be white, what does it mean to be black, and what's associated with belonging to each group. So it changes as time goes on, and that's because it's socially constructed. So I do want to show you something about our rules, American rules for classifying individuals. So in the United States, in general, race is something that's ascribed at birth, meaning an ascribed status, of course, is one that you don't really have a choice over. It's given to you at birth. So race, gender, those sort of things are ascribed statuses. In our society, historically, that's how you get your race, right? And for Americans, most Americans, the idea is your race is something that cannot change. Well, that's not true in every society, by the way. If you go to Brazil, for instance, they see race as something that is fluid. That is, your race can change over time. That's not how we see it. We see race, in general, we've been taught to see race as something that is lifelong. You belong to this group, you're born into it, you die in that group. Another thing that comes up is that race rules have been relatively arbitrary in the United States. And I'll give you an example here. You can take Barack Obama. President Barack Obama makes a great example here. So historically the rule was that if you have a parent who is one parent who is white, one parent who is black, then the child's race would be what? Right? What's the child's race? And historically, the child's race would be black, because if you go back in history, this was actually the law. They used to call it the one-drop rule, which was this idea that if you had quote-unquote, this is silly, but this was what they thought, if you had quote-unquote one drop of black blood, you were therefore black. That's why even presidents like Jefferson, that had kids with Sally Hemings, who was also a slave, technically her children were the children they had together. Even though as president of the United States, the children they had together were black, not seen as mixed race, not even really seen, and certainly not seen as white. And that was really because the slavery system, you couldn't have those people who were sort of stuck in the middle. If you're going to have a system where some people are enslaved, some people are not, you better make sure you know who belongs to each group. But that is really an arbitrary rule because, of course, that's not true, right? I mean, you would be mixed at best if these races were real. You'd be mixed, but we sort of have these rules that we did. So we call this in sociology hypodescent. So automatically the children of a union between different groups is put into the minority group. So it keeps groups sort of divided. So that's about it for race. I mean, there's a lot of material. That's not it for race, of course. You're going to get into a lot of material over 2 weeks, but I wanted to give you kind of an introduction, excuse me, so that you at least get to see this notion of the social construction of race. So y'all have, once again, a great week. Be sure you go in the materials folder. I got lots of good resources for this, things that you'll be checking out. So I think you'll find it really enlightening. So have a great week.